I thought my family was cold. Turns out, they were hiding a fire no one dared to touch. There's always been a silence in my house. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind you get after a long day, where everyone's just happy to exist together. No, ours was heavy. Suspicious. Like every word spoken was a negotiation. Like every look had a secret buried behind it. My name's Aiden. I'm 26. Grew up in Oregon but live in Chicago now. And I've always known something wasn't right with my family. You don't need to be a genius to feel it. You just need to be a kid sitting at the dinner table while your dad won't look at you, and your mom stabs her peas like they insulted her. My father, Henry, is British. Very British. Think stiff upper lip, emotionally unavailable, deadpan humor that somehow isn't funny. Growing up he was there. But barely. He provided. Paid bills. Fixed stuff. But he never laughed with me. Never hugged me. Never once said, "I'm proud of you." I used to think it was a cultural thing. But my mother, Evelyn, she's Canadian, warm on the outside, all polite smiles and kindness. Yet when it came to me, there was always a strange tension. Like she was overcompensating. Too affectionate sometimes. Nervous when people asked about my childhood. Always quick to change the subject. I stopped asking questions. Until a few months ago. It started when Henry got sick. Liver failure. Fast and brutal. The doctors said he needed a transplant. No time to waste. I didn't even hesitate. I told them, "Test me. I'll do it." But the results came back, weird. The doctor pulled me aside. His face told me everything before he even spoke. "Aiden, there's no biological match between you and Henry." "What does that mean?" I asked, trying to play dumb. "It means he's not your biological father." I laughed. I actually laughed. Because what else do you do when your world tilts sideways? "There must be a mistake," I said. "Run it again." They did. Same result. No DNA overlap. No shared markers. Zero blood relation. The man I called Dad my entire life wasn't. I went home that night in a daze. Walked through the front door and looked at Henry, frail, pale, on the couch with a blanket around his shoulders. He looked at me like he always had, indifferent. As if I were a guest. A stranger. But now I knew. Maybe I'd always been a stranger to him. "And Mom?" She froze when she saw my face. Like she knew I'd found something. Like she'd been waiting for this day since I was born. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I did what Henry always did. I watched. Silently. And then I started digging. What I found rewrote my entire bloodline. I thought the truth was that Henry wasn't my father. But it was so much worse. He was never supposed to be my father at all. I started with documents. Birth certificate. Hospital records. Old photo albums. On paper, everything lined up. Father, Henry Thomas Wexley. Mother, Evelyn Ann Hart. Born in Toronto, moved to the U.S. when I was 2. But the hospital listed no emergency contacts for my dad. No paternity test on file. Just signatures. Too clean. Too polished. I called my aunt, Mom's sister Caroline. She was always the outlier in our family. Didn't come around much. Moved to Nova Scotia years ago. But she used to dote on me when I was little. I asked her plainly. "Caroline, is Henry really my father?" Dead silence. Then a sharp inhale. "You found out," she said. That was all I needed to hear. But she kept talking. Like she'd been carrying the weight of it her whole life. "I begged her to tell you," she said. "But your mom, she couldn't. Or wouldn't. Too much shame. Too much at stake." "Shame for what?" I asked. More silence. Then came the bombshell. Henry wasn't her husband at first. He was her stepfather. Your grandma married him when your mom was 13. The world froze around me. She continued. voice shaking. They were only a family for a few years. He was much older. Reserved. Always so formal. Your grandmother adored him. Said he brought structure to the chaos. But Evelyn, she was 16 when things changed. Changed how? I asked, though I already knew. She fell in love with him, Caroline whispered. And it wasn't one-sided. I felt sick. Caroline rushed to clarify. She never said he touched her. She said it was a feeling. But she got pregnant. And then your grandma died. A car accident. Right when everything was falling apart. Did Henry know? I asked. No, she said. He was out of the country for work. Evelyn ran. She told him the baby was someone else's. A mistake. She begged him to help her. To raise you. And he did. My throat closed up. He married her? I asked. No. Never. He raised you like a duty. Like an atonement, maybe. But she always looked at you like you were something sacred. Because to her, you were. I ended the call and sat in silence. So that's what it was. Henry wasn't cold because he didn't care. He was cold because every time he looked at me, he saw the ghost of a line he never meant to cross. And Mom? She wasn't just hiding a lie. She was hiding a forbidden love. And I was its living, breathing consequence. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I just asked her one question. And it shattered her. That night, I drove home without turning on the radio. No distractions. Just the engine humming beneath a heart that felt heavier than ever. Mom was in the kitchen, chopping something. Soup, probably. She always made soup when she was anxious. I stood there watching her for a moment, memorizing the way her hands shook ever so slightly. Then I said it. Henry's not my father. She stopped mid-slice. Didn't turn. Didn't breathe. And I know he was your stepfather, I added. She dropped the knife. It clattered across the cutting board like a gunshot. She turned to me, face pale. Eyes already glistening. Who told you? She whispered. Does it matter? She sank into the nearest chair. Like her bones had finally given up. I sat across from her. And I didn't yell. I didn't flinch. I just asked one question. Why didn't you tell me the truth? She didn't speak right away. Her lips trembled. Her eyes darted to the floor, then to the window, like she wanted to run. Then she said it. I was 16. And I thought it was love. Her voice was so small, it didn't sound like her. He was kind to me in a way no man had ever been. After Mom married him, everything felt safe. Structured. But I didn't understand the difference between protection and power. I stayed silent. Let her speak. One night I kissed him. Just kissed. He pushed me away. Told me it was wrong. But something changed between us. The silence grew complicated. He left for London. A year later I was pregnant. I never told him. I told everyone it was someone else. A mistake I made at a party. And he believed me. Did he really? I asked softly. She hesitated. I don't know. Maybe he just wanted to believe it. He came back after Mom died. I begged him to help me raise you. To protect you from what I had become. What had you become, Mom? I asked. A victim? Or something else? Tears ran down her cheeks. I became a coward. I wanted to hate her in that moment. But I couldn't. Because I looked into her eyes and saw not just guilt, but shame. Shame so deep it had twisted her into someone even she didn't recognize. And Henry? I asked. He raised me knowing I wasn't his? She nodded. He never said a word. He just existed. Like a shadow in our lives. Like he was punishing himself by staying. Do you love him? I did, she said. Not anymore. Not for a long time. But I loved you more. I stood up. I need time, I said. She didn't beg. She just nodded, tears falling silently. And as I walked out the door, I realized the house I grew up in wasn't haunted. It was the ghost. And I was the only one still breathing inside it. I thought Henry was just distant. But now I understood, he wasn't cold. He was punishing himself. And I needed to know why. I found him on the back porch, sitting in his usual chair, a blanket wrapped around his thin frame. The air was sharp, the kind that bites at your skin but clears your head. He didn't look up when I stepped outside. Just kept staring at the darkened sky, like he was waiting for something that would never come. I sat across from him. No greeting. No small talk. Then I said it. I know you're not my father. His face didn't change. I watched him carefully. His breath came out slow and steady, fogging in the cold air. Then, finally, he spoke. She told you? She didn't have to. The test did. Silence. Then, Henry sighed. A long, tired exhale that sounded like it had been sitting in his chest for decades. I suspected, he said. I never asked? Never wanted confirmation. Why? I asked. He turned his head slightly, finally looking at me. His expression was unreadable. Because what would it have changed? I already knew I was raising a child that wasn't mine. I knew Evelyn had lied to me. But she was young. Alone. And I. He hesitated. I leaned forward. And you what? His grip tightened around the blanket. His voice came out quieter this time. I felt guilty. I swallowed hard. Because you knew she had feelings for you? He flinched. A small, almost imperceptible movement. Yes. The weight of that word settled between us. So what? I said. You felt guilty, so you took us in? Raised me like some kind of penance? His jaw tightened. I raised you because I owed her. Because I should have known better. I should have seen what was happening before it was too late. I stared at him, searching for something, anger, regret, love. Anything. Did you ever love me? I asked. Another pause. Then, slowly, he met my gaze. I respected you. Not the same thing. Not even close. That's not what I asked? His lips parted, as if he wanted to say something else. But nothing came. That was my answer. I nodded, standing up. My breath came out in short, icy puffs. Take care of yourself, Henry. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, his voice stopped me. Aiden. I paused. Then, for the first time in my life, I heard something different in his voice. Not warmth. Not affection. But regret. I may not have been your father, he said, voice barely above a whisper. But I never hated you. Not once. I didn't turn around. Instead, I just stepped inside, closing the door behind me. And for the first time, I realized. The man who raised me wasn't a villain. But he was never a father either. I should have hated him. But all I felt was emptiness. Like I'd spent my whole life loving a ghost. I left Henry sitting there in his chair. He didn't try to stop me. No parting words. No apology. Just the hollow sound of the clock ticking on the mantel, the echo of everything he never said. I drove for hours that night. Through towns I didn't know, streets with no names, gas station coffee and motel silence. I wasn't running, I just didn't want to be anywhere I was. My phone buzzed once. Mom, please let me know you're safe. I didn't answer. Because safe felt like a lie. For the first time, I was starting to question not just them, but me. My identity was no longer mine. My origin wasn't love. It wasn't even choice. I was born from secrecy. From shame. From a power dynamic no one dared speak aloud. And here's the part one hadn't told anyone. When I was 16, I also felt something strange around Mom. Something blurred. Not inappropriate. Not physical. But this intensity, like she looked at me and saw more than a son. Like I reminded her of something she once loved too deeply. Back then, I thought I was imagining it. Just teenage confusion. Now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe I'd inherited more than just DNA. Maybe I was carrying her guilt in my bones. Maybe that's why she flinched when I hugged her. Maybe that's why Henry could never look me in the eye for longer than 3 seconds. I was a living confession. And I had no idea how to forgive that. Not yet. I ended up back in Toronto. Went to the cemetery. Stood over my grandmother's grave, the woman who married Henry before she knew what he would become to her daughter. I whispered, "Did you know?" And of course, there was no answer. But deep down, I think she did. Because silence like this doesn't grow overnight. It's generational. Inherited like blood type. Passed down in closed mouths and dinner table stares. And now? Now I had a choice. Keep carrying it. Or burn it. I didn't go back for her sake. I went back for mine. Because some ghosts don't disappear until you face them in daylight. I knocked on the door like a stranger. She opened it like she'd been waiting. No makeup. No mask. Just Evelyn, the version of her I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Fragile. Frightened. Human. She stepped aside without saying a word. We sat at the kitchen table. The same one where she'd made my birthday cakes. Where she'd nervously stirred tea whenever someone mentioned the word father. There was a silence between us that used to be suffocating. Now it just felt real. "I'm not here for apologies," I said. She nodded. "Good. Because I have none that would be enough." I looked her in the eye. "You loved him." She swallowed. "I thought I did." "And me?" She paused. Then whispered, "You were my punishment. And my salvation. Both." That hit harder than I expected. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "I'm just done." She flinched. "With me?" "No," I said. "With the lie. With living like I was a mistake no one wanted to own. I'm done carrying what belongs to you. To Henry. To Grandma. All of it." Tears welled up in her eyes. But she didn't cry. She just whispered, "I don't know who I am without the secret." I leaned forward. "Maybe now's the time to find out." We sat there for a long time. No more questions. No more confessions. Just quiet. And not the heavy kind. A clean quiet. I left the house with no promise to return. No dramatic goodbye. But as I closed the door, I realized something. I hadn't been raised by villains. I'd been raised by cowards. And now? I was choosing to be something else. I used to think blood made you who you are. Turns out, it's what you do with it that defines you. A few weeks after I left Evelyn's house, a brown envelope showed up at my apartment. No return address. Inside, a sheet of paper, folded once. A paternity DNA report. I hadn't ordered it. But I knew who had. At the bottom, scrawled in my mother's delicate handwriting. "For the truth you deserve. E." The name of my biological father sat in bold print. Henry Thomas Wexley. And beneath that, probability of paternity, 99.99%. It shouldn't have shocked me. But it did. Because part of me, some small, childlike part, still hoped it wasn't him. Still clung to the idea that this whole thing was some bureaucratic error. That maybe there was another man, someone distant and unknown. Someone who hadn't raised me in a house full of cold air and buried shame. But no. It was him. The man who tucked me in when I was sick. The man who never called me son. The man who punished himself by staying. He was my father in every possible way. Except the one that mattered. So I made a decision. I packed the report, got in the car, and drove to his place one last time. He opened the door slowly. Said nothing when he saw me. I handed him the envelope. "I know," I said. "You don't know me anything. But I needed you to see this." He opened it. "Read it." No reaction. Not even a flinch. Then, after a long pause, he said, "I already knew. That hit me like a punch to the chest. For how long? I asked. Since you were 5. Maybe earlier. I stepped back. And you never said anything? I thought protecting you meant pretending, he said. But I see now, that was for me, not you. I nodded. I'm not here for forgiveness. Just closure. And then, almost too soft to hear, he said something I never expected. I did love you. I just didn't know how to show it, without it looking like guilt. That broke me a little. But I didn't let him see it. Too late now, I said. He nodded. Didn't argue. As I turned to leave, he added, You were never the mistake, Aiden. We were. The lie wasn't just between my mother and Henry. It was woven through generations, and I wasn't the only one caught in the web. After everything came out, I tried to move on. But some part of me couldn't stop wondering, was I the only one? The only secret child? The only buried truth? The only fracture in a family built on silence? So I did what people like me do when they need answers. I spit into a tube, mailed it off, and waited. 3 weeks later, I got the results from the ancestry site. Ethnicity breakdown? Whatever. What really mattered was this. You have a half-sibling. 49.6% DNA shared. Name, Olivia T., 34 years old. Location, Manchester, England. My hands went numb. Henry. He had another child. And unlike me, she got his name. His country. His choice. I debated for days. Should I message her? Was I opening a door I couldn't close? Eventually, I typed out a simple note. Hi. I know this might sound strange, but I believe we're half-siblings. I'd like to talk if you're open to it. No pressure. Aiden. She replied an hour later. I've been waiting for this message. Call me. Please. My heart pounded as I dialed the number. The British ringtone buzzed in my ear like a countdown. She answered on the second ring. Aiden? Her voice was calm. Soft. Older sister energy, even though we'd never met. I didn't know you existed until last year, she said. Our father, Henry, he told me on his 70th birthday. After 3 glasses of scotch. What exactly did he tell you? I asked. She exhaled. That when he dies, someone named Aiden might come looking for him. And that if I ever meet you, I should be kind. I laughed bitterly. Kindness. That's rich. She paused. He wasn't a warm man. But he was tortured. I think he hated himself for loving your mother. And hated himself more for loving you. Those words did something strange to me. Not healing. Not closure. Just context. I told Olivia everything. The full story. She didn't flinch. She didn't judge. When I asked her what their life had been like, she answered honestly. Formal. Cold. Distant. But never cruel. I think he left the part of him that could feel, with you. We talked for hours. And by the end of it, I realized. I wasn't alone anymore. Not in blood. Not in trauma. Not in trying to make sense of a man who never knew how to love cleanly. He was dying. But he still couldn't say the words. So I did. It was Olivia who called me. He's asking for you, she said. He didn't say it out loud, but I know. If you don't come now, you'll never get the chance. 2 days later, I was in London. The hospital was grey. Quiet. The kind of place where time slows down just enough to make you notice the sound of your own heartbeat. Henry was in room 214. He looked smaller than I remembered. Shrunken by sickness, yes, but more than that, he looked like a man who had spent decades swallowing things no human should ever have to keep down. He didn't open his eyes when I walked in. Didn't speak. But when I said, "It's me," his fingers twitched. I sat beside him. I didn't bring photos. I didn't bring closure. I just brought me. After a long silence, I said the one thing I never thought I'd say. Thank you? His eyelids fluttered slightly. Barely. Not for the lie, I continued. Not for the silence. But for staying. For trying, even if you never got it right. You didn't run. And maybe that means something. His lips moved. A sound came out, a soft rasp. I leaned closer. He was trying to say something. But the only word that came was, "Son." That was it. One word. But it hit harder than any apology. Because it wasn't just what he called me. It was who he finally saw me as. I stayed another hour. Held his hand. Said nothing else. When I left, I didn't look back. And when the call came 2 days later, "He's gone," I didn't cry. Because I had already buried him years ago. This was just the final stone. I was born from a secret. Raised in silence. But I won't die that way. After Henry's funeral, I flew home to Chicago with no suitcase, no souvenirs. Just peace. Not the loud, triumphant kind you see in movies. The quiet kind. The kind that comes when you finally stop asking why and start asking what now. I didn't go back to therapy. I didn't change my name. I didn't write a memoir or post a video. I just lived. I started small, coffee with old friends I had ghosted during my spiral. Weekly dinners with people who knew nothing about my bloodline, and loved me anyway. I didn't tell them my story. Not yet. Some things are sacred. Some scars don't need to be shown to prove they exist. Then one day, I got a letter. From Olivia. Inside was a photo. Aiden, age 3. In Henry's arms. He was holding me awkwardly, like he didn't know what to do with me. But in the photo, he was smiling. Genuinely. Behind the smile, I saw everything he never said. Regret. Pride. Fear. Love. I framed it. Not to forgive him. But to remind myself, you can't rewrite your beginning. But you can choose your ending. And that's exactly what I did. Last month, I asked someone to marry me. Her name is Claire. She knows everything. The whole story. I told her one night on the roof, under too many stars and one too many glasses of wine. She listened. No pity. No gasps. Just silence, the good kind this time. Then she said, "You didn't survive that. You rebuilt from it." She was right. I'm not the product of their shame anymore. I'm the author of my own bloodline. And if we ever have kids, I'll tell them everything. Not because they need to carry it, but because I don't want silence to be their inheritance.